with no further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Lindsay Smith.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and for all of the people who make this event possible, who bring us food and help deal with last-minute tech crises. So I really appreciate our for making this possible. And we'll see about the seance. I actually have a funny anecdote from my research about science lab-made seances in Argentina. So only for you all in HSB will you get to hear that. So today I'm doing a little bit of bridging work. With this title, Centering Justice, Human Rights, Social Movements, and Citizen-Led Science, I'm trained as an anthropologist, and so in some ways, the way we talk, the kind of theories, our preoccupations tend to be less directly applicable to the world. And one of the things I've noticed in the 9 months here, I work a lot with to elevate the voices of the people I work with, but I don't necessarily talk to policymakers. And so I tried then listening, doing my ethnographic work, trying to understand the complexity that is SFIS. And so this talk is an attempt for me to translate some of my questions into, I think, a language that we might share, a set of questions that many of us here at the school are engaged in. And the other bridging work I really like to do is that I often feel in our department we have our development technology folks and we have our policy and science studies folks. And I know that there are a lot of recent hires that mix the two of those. So this attempt is really a way to say how can we think from development, from elsewhere and otherwise, to ask core questions about what science is. So this image is from my fieldwork. It's part of a program by the Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, which is a human rights group in Argentina, and it's called Twitter Relatos, which are little Twitter stories, and it's an image and a poem. This is a picture of a map of Argentina, and you can see how the artist has created an image of a person coming out of darkness into light. In case you don't speak Spanish, the small poem at the bottom is, "They are looking for me, but I wasn't lost. They hid me. I myself am looking for myself." So I started out with citizen-led science because I was trying to speak to citizen science, but actually as I was writing and thinking about this paper, I came up with a different term, which I'd like to propose to you today, which is science otherwise. So rather than trying to engage in citizen science or citizen-led science, I really like to think about what science otherwise might be and what practicing thinking from and thinking with science otherwise might allow us to do in the world. So the theoretical basis for this is kind of 3 genealogies. One is Quirijo and Wallerstein's idea of Americanity. So this is a theory that they put forward to argue that the ideas of modernity, so modernity and science go hand in hand, but they make the argument that the modern, and particularly the scientific modern, cannot be imagined or done without the Americas. So rather than talking about modernity as if it happened independent of the Americas, they propose this other term, Americanity. So we shouldn't be talking about modernity, we should be talking about Americanity because the Americas are at the center of that very process. And you can even think of something like Darwin, right, in his theory of evolution. We don't tell that story as a story of the Americas, but we could tell it, right, with Galapagos and the discoveries and the voyages. So they make an argument that practices of colonialism and knowledge production emerged together. And so part of my kind of troubling of science is to draw this lineage of Americanity to say perhaps science itself is not otherwise if it comes from and is rooted in Latin American values and ideas, but that it always has been, and part of our work is uncovering that. The second is technological genealogies. So we often don't think, and in fact I just taught my last development, I've taught 501, the Introduction to Technology and Development. We talked about R&D not happening in the developing world, but I think part of the problem is we use the words R&D, right? And we look for R&D departments and we look for businesses to do that. But certainly in my own work, which I'm going to talk about more deeply, we can see that many technologies did emerge in Latin America for Latin American uses. Argentina constantly, you go to Argentina, they're like, did you know we invented the radio? Did you know we invented the bus? And one of the things that Argentines invented was forensic DNA. 2 years before it was ever used in England for forensic purposes, it was used in Argentina in a very different context, which is what I'm going to talk about today, and how that history of placing the technology and its development back in the context in which it emerged, and really paying attention to that, made us think and help us think about some of the paradoxes of that. And that's the topic of my book, so, which is not out yet, but I keep calling it into being because I think that's a helpful thing to do. And finally, I think that the third place I come from is the social science and social movements literature. So the one that looks at the way that social movements take up science for their own ends, and the way that place comes to matter for science. So there's a vast and important literature on this that looks at what value social movements might put on science, how they utilize it for specific ends, and the ways in which social movement participation in science can create problems for traditional Mertonian ideas of science: objective, separate, pure. So that's all the theory you guys have to listen to today. If you want to know more about any of these theories, feel free to talk to me. I'm happy to send you literature reviews. But most of my talk is going to be a triptych. So I use the concept of a triptych, I think, for two reasons, because I'm going to talk about three things, but three things that together make a whole. And the other is I want to allude to religion. So the way in which triptychs have mystical and important power. When we take these images, for much of the history of triptych as an art form, it has been a form of religious iconography, with often a centered picture of the Passion or the Christ, followed by peripheral figures at the side. And so I invoke that in this talk as one way of thinking about alternative ontologies and epistemologies that might underlie some of the practices of science that I've seen in my fieldwork. And then finally, I'm going to conclude with a discussion of citizen-led science, or science otherwise, and talk about its affordances and its limits. So to put out this idea of science otherwise, I'm going to give you a definition. So I think otherwise is a really interesting word. So obviously I'm not using it correctly, although people do kind of use this in this way. So it can be used in two ways as an adverb, to discuss circumstances different from the present, or considered, or else, and then in other respects, or apart from that. And finally, it can be an adjective in a different state or situation. I think those three are really important for thinking about what my project of science otherwise might be. So I am interested in what happens when we look at science out of its traditional context, whatever those might be. So it's different from the present, or different from what we consider. But I'm also interested in alternative ontologies and epistemologies. So what do you think? Well, how might we pay attention to science that is done in other respects? And finally, is it possible that science otherwise is in a completely different state? Is it something that is other? And what does that mean for its power in a homogenized world? So the question I'm going to answer for you today, I hope by the end, and I'd like to discuss more, is what might a science otherwise look like? I'm going to offer you some examples. And finally, a conversation I'd love to have with you all, because I think you might have your own examples of science otherwise. What kinds of futures does science otherwise enable? And this image for me is one that, it's a poster that the Abuelas also created, but it was in the house of one of a young man who was born in captivity, was kidnapped, raised by the people actually who murdered his parents, and then found out his identity in his 20s via DNA testing. And he had this hanging prominently in his living room, and it obviously says mother, and it's a collection of images. And I point to it as one example of the kind of science otherwise I'm talking about. There's no images of DNA. There's no way in which this motherhood or femininity or even pregnancy or children are excised from this practice of science. In fact, poetry figures at its center. And yet all of this is enabled by scientific practices, by the appropriation, use, and development of fragment DNA. So again, it's one that prefigures and puts forward other kinds of imaginaries of the world that are enabled through scientific practice. So just to give you a little bit of context, I'm going to be talking about 3 countries and violence there, and the ways in which human rights social movements have responded to that through scientific methods. So just to give you context, the 3 countries I'm talking about are Argentina, Peru, and Mexico. So Argentina had a military dictatorship from 1976 to 1984, and there's an estimated 30,000 people disappeared. So that's the term they use in Argentina, desaparecidos. But in English we could talk missing, murdered. So in Peru, the repression was from 1980 to 2000, and there's an estimated 70,000 people missing and murdered. When I originally wrote this, I put victims here. And when I was reviewing my slides for this presentation, I thought, well, how problematic that I only number the victims as those who were missing or murdered, because obviously the victims of repression, as I'll talk about in a minute, the goal of repression is actually to victimize an entire society. So when we're employing science and social movements as an answer to this, often what we're attempting to heal is what's broken, what has been broken by that repression. And finally, I'm going to talk about Mexico, which is my newest work, working on the migrant trail and looking at migrant-related violence, migration-related violence. And so the statistics I have from 2006 to 2019 in family groups estimate that 120,000 people have been missing or murdered. And part of the reason I put this under the larger rubric of Cold War repression is that part of my argument is that the violence that we see, the cartels, the kind of disappearance, the practices of murder and extortion that are happening in Mexico today and in Guatemala and Central America are not disconnected from the very same technologies and techniques that were developed in Argentina, exported through the rest of Central America through practices of the CIA, and that the same people, we can trace it very easily, gang leaders and cartel leaders were trained at the schools of America in these very techniques. So these techniques are now being used to create terror not at the hands of the state, but in the interest of other kinds of powers, but the methods are the same and the effects, I would say, are similar. There's important differences, and I don't want to over-homogenize, but for the purpose of this talk, I think that drawing that genealogy can be important. So again, these are some images of what that violence looked like. So this is a very famous picture from the Getty of one of the few times that we saw a disappearance in the public streets of Buenos Aires. So a young man dressed in jeans, inappropriate, a liberal, clearly marked, if you can't read that, being dragged away as he was resisting into the street. And I think migration-related violence takes many forms, but one of them is this seeming like agentless violence of train wrecks or drownings in the river, right? That theorists and scholars of the border pointed out obviously aren't agentless, right? That they are a form, they're not a natural form of violence, they're an imposed and created form of violence, in addition to kidnappings and disappearances on the part of both military forces and drug cartels. So again, to draw out this genealogy, I just want to talk about the idea of technologies of terror. So there was an explicit attempt in the 60s and 70s to develop a science of terror that started out in Algeria. And then the French came to Argentina after seeing failures in Chile's attempt to stop repressions. When Chile people were rounded up, they were murdered in a stadium. It was a public form, initially a public form of disappearance, and that turned out not to actually be very effective in stopping protests. And so Argentina looked at Chile and thought, oh, this is not what we want to do. They import expertise from France, who had used it in Algiers. And they came in and they said, you know, there's a way to create terror at the level of society, and it's through these mechanisms. So the first and foremost is disappearance. So there's this practice of taking people away from their homes in the dead of night and then offering no explanation. So there's no public event. There's no ability, there's no shared moment, there's no ability for the person to either be a martyr or to give voice to their political dissidents. And then there's a practice of detention and torture, so people are detained for some time, they're tortured to get as much information out of them as possible. And then in particular Argentina, they innovated the use of death flights and clandestine burials. So they would take people, they would drug them, take them up in planes, and then have soldiers, conscripts, push them out into the River Plate, still alive to their point, so that they could claim that they didn't actually kill them, that the death happened. And it was an entire mechanism on the part of the state. A priest stood on the runway and absolved the people who were going up in the flights, and then there were two people, one to fly the plane and then one to dump the bodies. And the importance of this was that bodies would not be connected directly to the state, but they would appear. So they would wash up on the banks, they would wash up in the rivers, and so there would be this constant presence of death, but a death that doesn't have an agent. We don't know where it comes from, we don't know who they are. I was talking to one of my neighbors when I lived in Argentina, and she was remembering this time period from when she was a child. She said, I was young, I was innocent, I didn't know. I remember going on a date with my boyfriend at the time, and we're in the river, and I'm sitting out on a beautiful day, a beautiful afternoon, having a picnic, and all of a sudden I see these white things floating. And so the river would come, and there would be these little white objects that would appear. And then the tide started going out, and suddenly I saw that it was a hand. And I ran screaming to my boyfriend, and I said, there's a hand, there's a body body in the river. And he immediately packed me into the car and said, don't say anything. These aren't the kinds of things you see or talk about. So again, you can see that the point of, I don't know if the point, but at least the theory of this form of terror is that it's generalized, that it's aimed at the population, not just the subversive group, and that, that bodies and death and disappearance play centrally in it. And this is a picture of one of the clandestine detention centers. And it's also public-private. So Argentina hosted the World Cup during this period of repression, and in the basement of the stadium where they held the World Cup was a clandestine detention center. So they won the World Cup that year. The president is seen celebrating, and below it is one of these torture and detention sites. So it's both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. Just as we're all feeling uncomfortable with our lunches, I want to say my partner always tells me that my party trick is bringing everybody down. So here we go. We have more torture and death to talk about. I think there's a point to it. I hope it's not gratuitous. So in the 1980s, these ideas are expanded throughout Latin America through Operation Charlie, which is an operation paid by the CIA. The Argentine method is exported to other sites in Latin America. So it's both taught at the School of America, but also teams of Argentine specialists are sent to Guatemala, to Honduras, to Mexico, to impart their expertise and knowledge. And so you can actually trace, and scholars have traced the moment in which repression and violence techniques in Guatemala shift from raising of whole villages and killing of Mayan villagers to disappearance, to the arrival of these teams. So again, this is a form of knowledge that creates particular kinds of terror and particular kinds of disappearances. And I have gone in depth in this not to horrify all of you, but to really say that if we're looking at science otherwise, we always have to look at context. So the context in which these social movements I'm looking at emerge is one where what has been broken takes on a particular form, right? It's heavily emphasized on bodies. It's one in which those bodies are taken for an extended period of time, so they don't appear in the same clothes, they don't appear in the same places, and so this necessitates a kind of innovation that you wouldn't otherwise need. Traditionally, if you find a body, you would look at their face and you would identify them. You would look at their clothes and you would identify them. But if you have long periods of detention, the clothes aren't the same. If people are drowning, the ability to use these traditional methods of identification no longer work. So the emergence of the particular kind of identification regimes that happen in Argentina is tied to the particular technologies of terror. So I'm going to spend some time on my central triptych, which is Argentina, because I worked there the longest, and then offer you my two additional ones as other places to think about what science otherwise might look like. So this is my alternative forensic DNA origin story. So in addition to the disappeared, these young men and women who were detained and killed that I just told you about, there's another group of disappeared, which are the nietos. These are missing grandchildren. So they are a generation below the disappeared. They are young children who were either born in captivity, so their mothers were taken to clandestine detention centers because they were pregnant and because it was a highly Catholic country. They didn't murder women who were pregnant, they allowed them to give birth. They immediately took the baby away, and then they murdered the mother the same day. So these babies were born in these kind of centers, and they were then fed out to an existing network of black market adoptions. So rich and important and powerful people in Argentina adopted these children. If they weren't able to, if it wasn't on the existing black market, it was known in general in Buenos Aires and in other cities that if you went back to the back door of some of these clandestine centers on a specific night, they would give you a baby. So I was talking to a cab driver and he said that, one night he telling me about my project and he was saying, we almost became part of this process of stealing these children. My wife was infertile, we weren't able to have children. We were talking to the nurse about it and they said, if you go Tuesday night to ESMA, which is the Escuela, the Naval Academy, they'll give you a baby. And he said they planned on it, they were going to do it, they desperately wanted a baby, and that night something just chilled them. And so they didn't do it. And he said, we could very well have been the kind of people who adopted these children. So there's those kind of more innocent bystanders who are participating in a black market adoption. And there's also generals and people who take these children as part of a genocidal ideological regime. So they raise them up to change the way that they view the world. So some of my participants talked about how as children they learned a song that had leftist undertones at school and they would come home and sing it and their fathers would beat them, saying that I promised to break this Marxist idea out of view, right? So there's this sense that there certainly are cases where generals and former repressors adopted the children that were born in these captivity centers. But the important part of this is that a group of grandmothers that are known as the abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, the imagery I've been showing so far comes from them, is a group of women in their 50s and 60s who organized to try to find these babies. And this is them at a march saying, where are the hundreds of babies that were born in captivity? So it's an example of Juliana, who is actually a sister of one of these children, and it's her example of looking for her brother. So she says, I have the sense of an eternal pregnancy. I last remember my mother with her belly, and even though someone was born in that clandestine detention center, my brother Ignacio Garcia has not yet been born. Now, more than 30 years since the dictatorship, there are those who still live under its boots. We will never have democracy until every one of those people knows who they are. If you have doubts, please come forward. So this is at an event that's a rock concert by a famous Argentine rock star. And part of what they do, even they did it with a U2 concert, is they will come out afterwards, they'll tell their story, and they'll ask young adults in the audience if they have doubts about their identity, and if so, will they come forward to be identified via DNA. But before that, I think we have to think a little bit about why the family becomes so central in the social movement in Argentina, why are grandmothers going to the streets and not other people. Is that part of the goal of torturing? This is Jacobo Timmerman. He was one of the people who was taken to this clandestine detention center and then let out. And he talks about how the form of torture actually worked at destroying the family ties, so that the ways in which torture was practiced destroyed an entire culture based on familial love, devotion, and the capacity for mutual sacrifice collapses. Nothing is possible in such a universe, and that is precisely what the torturers know. So the grandmothers did something I would argue pretty amazing in their work, which is they searched and searched for some way to identify these missing nietos. So they would hear stories of children that appeared in a neighborhood of Cordoba who a woman had never been pregnant and there was this baby. They would go, they would say, that looks exactly like Fulanito. He has the same hair, that looks just like my son. And then they would try to file a court case and get that child back. And of course, the courts were still, at the time of the dictatorship, packed with judges who immediately denied this. And so their initial technology that they used was radiography. So they demanded radiographs of the children's long bones to argue that they were older than they said they were, because they had been taken at a different point. And that did not go anywhere. So the technology wasn't precise enough. And so as they tell their own story, they traveled the world looking for an answer to this problem. And every time they would go to the Vatican to talk to the Pope about their disappearing nietos, or they would go to New York to give a talk about the case in Argentina, they would also try to meet with local scientists. And they would say, please, 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 can you give us something that will allow us to prove our relationship to these kids? And finally, they met with an Argentine scientist in New York. His name is Penchadash, and he looked at the blood bank there. He said, we've been looking at HLA proteins for transplants, and we've been able to see some affiliation and process and group identification. And I think that with HLA, at this time paternity wasn't really accepted in courts either, but there's been some initial forays into paternity tests. I think that we might be able to prove this. And so the AAAS sent a team of scientists down to work with the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo. Mary Claire King, who's famous for identifying the BRCA gene, was one of those. And they worked for a year with the grandmothers to reconstruct family genealogies, to get blood samples, to try to develop a calculus possible to use HLA protein to identify these missing children. So at the time, DNA as we know it didn't exist. They were using a proxy for the system through HLA. And they developed, in the course of this, the first national genetic database, the Banco Nacional de Datos Genéticos, and they did the first forensic DNA identification, and that was the case of Paula Logares in 1983, a young girl who was matched to her grandmother and returned that year to her. And so really, we see that the efforts of these women paired with scientists allowed for the creation of a new test that has traveled throughout the world and is used in many contexts now. So I wanted to speak a little bit about what kind of genetics is at work in the case of the grandmothers, and I argue that it's genetics as a form of restitution. So DNA plus statistical inferences allows for a kind of virtual return. So this is an example of the kind of statistical reconstruction that the database did. And now people use other markers to do it, STR markers, but at the time they were using HLA. So they're able to get samples from blood relatives, and they're able to virtually reconstruct the missing disappeared person. So the disappeared person isn't there to give their own DNA, but through a statistical estimation, you can recreate what their markers would be, and based on that, you can identify what they may potentially have passed on to their children. But it's actually a quite difficult problem because of all of the uncertainty of how markers are passed down. And particularly in the case of HLA, because it's not all that discriminating. But I argue in the case of Argentina, it's more than restitution, right? So it's not the act of the virtual return of the disappeared and the practical return of the grandchildren, but actually what I argue is reconstitution. So there's a restitution, a material return, either of a body or of a missing child, but there's also a constitution. So the grandmothers, through their social organizing, through these processes, through their relationships to global scientific networks, through choosing Mary Claire King, who has a particular social justice advocacy view of science, they constitute new political possibilities in social relationships. And I argue that DNA, in this case of science otherwise, is a form of reconstitution. So these material practices of identification become politically constitutional. So new forms of science are formed and new practices of democracy are created. And finally, I think really importantly, new kinds of subjectivities are formed. So it's not just that new political processes are formed, but new kinds of subjects, new kinds of citizens. So if we take the posits of citizen science seriously, which is that participating in scientific projects would not only help science, but make us better citizens, we can look at these citizen-led projects of science otherwise as also creating new kinds of subjectivities, new kinds of arrangements and possibilities for being in the world, and new avenues for the practice of democracy. So an example of some of the ideas that emerged in the 80s in Argentina, that identity can't be imposed and knowing your identity is a right, these seem commonplace to us now. Your identity is a right that you should have, or that identity cannot be imposed. But those are in fact not common in the 1980s. The thought was that adoption should be secret, that identity was in fact taught, right? And that identity isn't a right? Why would identity be knowing who you are in this sense be enshrined as a right? And in fact, the grandmothers changed international law on the rights of the child by making identity a right of children. And I don't mean these are innocent. So on my final slide, I don't mean to say there's any innocent position. These are biologized notions of identity. It's very problematic to reduce identity to genes, to say that identity can't be imposed. And the grandmothers take a very radical position that all adoption is wrong. All adoption is complicit as a form of crime, right? So, but what I want to point to is that this science practice from kinship, from the needs of a particular situation, a particular way, create a view of the world, a view of citizens within it, and a set of practices that lead not only to systems of accountability or the actual return of children, but also these more diffuse ideas of who we are and how we should practice them. Okay, so these are my side panels in my triptych. So smaller, I'm not going to be able to give you as much information about them, but I think they're important in thinking about the full breadth of what citizen-led science or science otherwise might look like. So I did a project on a science diplomacy initiative by the United States, which paired Argentina, Peru, and Guatemala, provided funding for DNA databanks and for DNA analysis in order to create justice in those countries. So it was funded by the State Department, administered by USAID, and so I compared these three sites. And I arrived in Peru in 2015 to do this research. I've already done research in Argentina, I've already done my research in Guatemala, I've seen their shining labs, I've looked and interviewed people who've been identified, and in Peru, I find no lab at all. What I actually find is these potato farms. So you can't see in this picture, but these people are wearing EPAF, which is the Equipo Peruano de Antropología Forense, which is the people who won the grant. They're wearing their t-shirts and they're digging in the dirt for potatoes. Here's a woman at a market. She's doing kind of a classic human rights claim of holding up a picture of her son, but rather than standing next to a body, which is often what we see in this kind of imagery, she's actually standing at a market selling corn. So the interesting thing that happened in Peru is this money was given to the organization. They went to the highlands of Peru, they talked to local communities, and they said, we're here, give us your DNA, we're gonna exhume the graves, we'll identify and return everyone. And the people in Peru, in these highland communities, said, actually, no thank you. They said, what we would really like from you is money to start a potato collective, to make potatoes to feed, potatoes to sell, and potatoes to go to external market. They should have gotten into quinoa, is what I really think, but they were focused on little purple potatoes. So next time you eat your purple potatoes, you think about science otherwise. So the EPOF continues to do exhumations when they're invited to do exhumations, when there are cases of identity not being known, and you can see that in the third picture, but most of their efforts in highland villages have actually been development focused, and now they run forensic training and anthropological training that's focused on development as a reparative technique and technology. So in the very same killing fields of highland Peru, people are now growing potatoes, and that's partly because the organization has an ethic, a particular form of scientific practice that privileges community's interests first and foremost. So not the State Department's interests, not even the Peruvian Truth Commission's interests, but the community's interests. And the interesting and important thing to know about Peru is that violence was actually neighbor on neighbor. So often one person would join the Shining Path, they would kill neighbors, and people were buried in a place that families knew. So they would arrive and they'd say, oh, we'll exhume them. We'll use forensic DNA to prove that the genocide happened. And people said, well, I still have to live with my neighbor. And we found a way to live with one another, right? But if we exhume these bodies, it's not going to tell me something that I don't already know. I know where my son is buried. I don't have the problems of Argentina. There's not missing people. That unearthing this process, which can be very important for international accountability, in fact, doesn't serve the needs of my community. And that's a huge, in some ways, counterintuitive justice move, right? It's not what the State Department anticipated. It's certainly not what EPOF anticipated. It's not what I anticipated. But it was what the community wanted, and they continue to have annual potato harvests and support funneled through the non-existent forensic DNA lab to the potato farm. So to kind of think about this case study, I wanted to introduce you to Ruha Benjamin's idea of informed refusal. So we talk often about informed consent and the necessity of getting people to understand before they consent, but we don't talk about the rights of people to refuse to participate. That it's just as important to really acknowledge and to stop projects if the community doesn't want them. And I think about this in my development class, we talked a lot about this, about what would happen if people did refuse. If they're like, oh, you're gonna transform my way of life, can I just say no? Thank you, but no. There's often not a lot of space for that, and for me, actually, it was amazing to find that in Peru in this case. So finally, I want to talk about Mexico and Solecito. It's a mother collective in Veracruz, which is a state of Mexico that has a lot of alcohol-related violence and migration-related violence. By migration-related violence, I don't mean that migrants are enacting violence, but that violence is enacted upon migrants. In fact, in much of Mexico, human trafficking is much more profitable than drug trafficking these days. So, thank you. I'm finishing up here. This is my last example. So Solecito is a group of mothers who got fed up with people doing nothing about all the missing and their missing sons, their missing children in the state of Veracruz. So they went out with this guy on the right, who was their digger, and in their dresses and in their nice shoes to areas outside of the city where people were known to have been buried, and they started digging up shallow graves. They decided that they wouldn't wait any longer for the state to do something, and they would begin to do it themselves. And interestingly, they have a drone project, so they're one of the first groups in all of Mexico to use drones to try to identify these graves. So they decided that, that Veracruz is very jungly, to track through the underbrush is very hard, and so they've actually developed a pilot drone identification process to find these graves. And they demand first that the state or that a trained forensic team come in and do the excavation, but in the face of silence and of neglect and of the unwillingness to do it, they do it themselves. So there's been a lot of critique of Solicito in Mexico, and perhaps for fair reasons, that the process of using non-scientific methods to excavate these graves, in fact, makes it the data not usable in justice processes, right? So they exhume these, but then they contaminate them, right? That they don't engage in the correct forensic process to be able to use this for justice. And the response of these mothers and other groups is justice doesn't happen anyway. Less than 1% of crimes in Mexico are ever prosecuted, and even less than that are convicted. So there's little to no justice to be had, and so they refuse to participate. They attempt first to participate in forensic regimes, but in the face of neglect, they go out and do it themselves. And you know, one of the interesting things about Solicito is they do DNA, so this top picture is a body identified via DNA, and they partner with different organizations to try to do that. But at the same time, they say that the act of unearthing these graves in and of itself, of touching and of seeing their missing children, is important to them, that has importance and that has meaning even outside of a system that doesn't work in Mexico. So I think they're an example of mothers, hackers, rebels. They're certainly attacked by the government, they're attacked by scientists, and they're attacked by the drug cartels who don't want these sites unearthed. But at the same time, in Mexico, because people are disappeared and killed in the clothes they were wearing, they have a great deal of success in finding the people they're looking for in these shallow graves. And they're some of the few people doing anything in these cases. And so I think this is another example of science otherwise, and I think one of the questions that Solicito poses to us is, can we allow citizen-led science even if it becomes bad science, right? Is it possible? Is it possible to have an epistemology or a sense of care or a set of practices that might actually be anti-scientific, right? Can they use drones and excavation tools and measurements but not be certified and therefore not able to do it in the correct kinds of ways? Can we allow for that breadth within the realm of science? Or does that become something else? So to conclude, I want to emphasize there is no innocent position. So I'm not trying to say, let's look at social movements, let's look at mothers, they're good, scientists are bad, right? But that looking at science otherwise, we see that there are multiple arrangements and configurations of power. That there are ways of organizing scientific projects that privilege citizens and privilege their interests, often with unexpected ends. So I don't think that we can simply say that citizen-led science is an unqualified good, right? It is just like perhaps top-down vertical science, problematic in certain kinds of ways. But also, I would argue that at least one of the important possibilities that should exist and be enabled in the world, should mothers be able to make their own mistakes when excavating graves that aren't otherwise excavated. So I think part of the reason to attend to science otherwise is that it reivindicates and revitalizes alternative ontologies. So I think Argentina, I would argue, that an example of DNA as care. So regardless of whether children are identified, I think an important point is that 500 children have been missing. It's been 40 years since they were disappeared, and only 120 have been identified. So it's not for a failure of technology, it's not for a failure of funds, it's not for a failure of publicity. The inability to identify people is because people do not want to be identified, right? So the act of DNA is not one of easy accountability or easy practice, but yet the grandmothers constantly engage in it. They raise money for this DNA data bank. They go to concerts over and over again asking people to come forward. And I argue in my book that DNA is a form of care. That the practice of DNA, the virtual reconstruction of the disappeared through this DNA database, regardless of its efficacy or its outcome, is a practice of care in and of itself. And I think Peru points to the possibility of a community-centered science, right? One that doesn't meet the needs or interests of the State Department or of the international tribunals, but in fact meets the need of the community, even if it means that that community will not be able to participate in broader justice processes in Peru. And I think similarly to the mothers in Solicito, one of the things the Peruvians point to is that in Guatemala they did participate. They built the DNA database. People participated. They unmasked these graves. They showed that genocide had happened. You know, Rios Montt was convicted of genocide, and then it was overturned, right? So political pressure meant that the Supreme Court overturned that case, right? And so he is no longer, he was the first case of a local conviction of genocide. And so again, the belief that participating in these scientific regimes will lead to the outcomes that they hope is, I think, not necessarily widely appreciated in these countries. And finally, I think Mexico can point to the possibility of getting beyond forensic ontologies of the dead. So Mexico itself has a long history of the importance of bones and bodies within the spiritual, cosmological, and nationalistic practices. We can think of the Day of the Dead, Aztec, and Mayan traditions that valorize the dead. And so interviewing and talking to members of Solicito could argue that their practices may not be towards forensic ends. It may not be to make the body visible for forensic purposes, but it may be for other spiritual, practical, and community-based purposes that in Mexico have real power, right? The organization, despite being vilified and attacked and put in danger, are also seen as an incredibly powerful force of people who are doing something and are potentially changing their community. So I just want to conclude with some images I think speak to science otherwise. So this is an artistic rendition of the genocide in Guatemala, and it says, I don't hear, I don't see, and don't speak, never again. And it's an image of a man, an indigenous man, clearly ethnically marked Mayan within the Guatemalan context, and the wings are made from the bones of cadavers found. So again, it's using scientific imagery, photographs that we might think of as scientific, but superimposing them on images of indigenous revival and identification. And finally, I think that this work of science otherwise is particularly important now. It's the 5-year anniversary of Ayotzinapa, which is the 43 missing students that were not identified in Mexico. And along with that came the announcement this week that all detainees, immigrants, there's a proposal to take DNA samples from all of the migrants that are detained along the US-Mexico border. So asking to what ends our science work, whose needs are they meeting, and how we can engage in practical, meaningful, and democratically altering scientific practices remains really important. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lindsay. That was great. How are you guys doing? Do you have some questions, some comments? Yes, please.
Yeah, you said that the grandchildren from Argentina are now in their 40s. I imagine that makes the grandmothers certainly in their 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
As they leave this world, how do you envision this? Do you think this whole period of history just wraps itself up as an ugly period of history, or are there people who are continuing this work now?
Can I take one more? Yes. Is there another hand? Yeah.
Yeah, I had one. It's kind of revelatory, Lindsay. Thank you for helping me understand that privacy is based on the assumption that identity is stable or it's known. And with the, I'm wondering what you can tell us about how Americans can learn about the stories of Argentina, Peru, Mexico. We have a very vocal privacy angle and an accelerated desire to collect DNA on ourselves and learn more about each other. And then we have these two colliding forces. When does that change our assumptions about justice within America?
Do you want to take this one?
Well, those are wonderful questions. So, Lori, to answer your question, these grandmothers are dying. So many of the women that I interviewed and worked with have passed in recent years. And so the 120 nietos who have been identified, and then other children who were not disappeared but were child-aged when their parents were disappeared, have taken over the helm. So every year they add newly identified nietos and children to the board of directors. And they still identify as abuelas, but the organization is increasingly directed and steered by these young people. And I think that's why you see Twitter relatos, you say Insta for identities, when they just did this year. I remember a conversation when I first started about using Facebook, and the old director was like, oh my God, Facebook, who knows who could contact us on us, it's not safe. I mean, you could argue now that the grandmothers have one of the most sophisticated social media campaigns anywhere of social movement that I've seen. So there is this transition. And the other, I think, is the materiality, the guarantee of the database, which has a repository of their blood samples. So in Argentina, they still use blood. is funded in perpetuity until every single Nieto is identified. And interestingly, Juliana, who was the one who I talked about, her brother Ignacio, who actually, the baby was found, it wasn't a boy, it was a girl, and she was identified, but I remember talking with her about how, her sense that she would be the last person to not find her missing sibling, and that they would shut shop. They'd be like, well, 499 or 500, tough luck, and she would be holding forever this unknown. But there is a commitment on the part of the state and a commitment in the movement to keep going. But it is a real shift. And the question of privacy is a really, really important one. I love how you phrased that question and the complexity of it. I actually started this project in Argentina because my family's Argentine, knew about this case study, but as an American raised in America, I just could not believe that people who were targeted and killed by the state, rounded up, their children were stolen, would willingly give the state their DNA profiles. I was like, it didn't compute for me at all as an American. And as soon as I got there, all my Argentine friends were like, well, you weird Americans and your sense of privacy. And they're like, we have to give urine samples when we go for a job interview, right? Like the sense that the body and biology is private is something that is certainly not at the forefront there. And I do think that the question in the US is really complex. So if you look at adoptees or children of sperm donors, they willingly, happily give up their DNA without any thoughts about the repercussions, because the goal of what they can imagine getting through DNA is in that privacy, where you come to them and you say, what about privacy? Or even these internet sleuths who help connect adoptees to their parents. So I've interviewed a couple of them and say, well, aren't you violating people's privacy? And they're like, well, there is no assumption of privacy, but how can we even think about privacy in the face of a crime? So part of it is the kind of exceptionality of these kinds of spaces. I do think it's a harder sell when you look at all the, consumer DNA databases and the way that people upload their DNA for curiosity, and then we're all surprised when serial killers and other things are found. It's like every person working on DNA has been saying, be careful, law enforcement's going to use this, be careful, law enforcement's going to use it, and then people are surprised. So I think that is yet to play out. Like, I do think that the lesson from Argentina is that privacy is perhaps not people's top value. I would say even the Facebook scandal points to us that privacy may be less interesting than fun, right? I mean, so we as scholars and ethicists spend a lot of time thinking about privacy. I'm not actually sure that the average American cares, right? I think that might be a legacy of certain kinds of ethical frameworks that have emerged. So Facebook, I think, points to that, and certainly the way we give away our information with those little swipe cards all the time points to that. So like 20 cents less is more appealing than privacy. So I don't know, it's an open question. I would love to talk with you more about it.
We can maybe take just a couple of other questions or comments. Yeah, Kat?
So forward-looking now, you mentioned it's the 5-year anniversary of the 42 disappeared. People are still disappearing. We have children on the side of the US-Mexico border who are locked up. Where do you foresee future practices? Like, what can we take away, or where do you see the direction going in either DNA retrieval? So, like, this DNA is dealing with the dead, the missing who are dead. Like, we have people who are currently alive who may be missing from their rest of their lives. Where do you see future practice going?
So,
is there one other comment? Sorry. Great.
So I think a lot about this. So there's this way that I think that DNA is collected on children in detention, and the practices of collecting Homeland Security and collecting DNA from these children made it natural to seem like we now should collect DNA from all migrants. And it wouldn't surprise me if part of the justification that emerges in the following weeks is that it's actually humanitarian, right? It's not just for law enforcement purposes, but it's actually for humanitarian purposes. So I do think there's this way that we easily creep back and forth from kind of a humanitarian, human rights discourse, which we could argue may always operate in this way, and a security discourse. So part of my new research is looking specifically at social movements and how they are drawing on technologies, alternative technologies, to try to ensure their interests, right? So facial recognition, drones to rescue kidnappers, or migrants who've been kidnapped before they end up being dead because the state can't step in. Or forms of database creation that are more ethical, right? So what are these groups doing? I do think that it's an overdetermined field and it's very difficult to operate in. I guess I'm working with Octavio right now on a bioethics on the border, trying to think about some of these case studies and what we can do from the ethical frameworks that our government has adopted to try and at least say that if we're going to engage in these practices, we have to engage in them ethically, because not only, ethically by our own standards, like not only are these practices happening, but there's no informed consent, there's no discussion about destruction of samples, there's no rights, and so often the language of crisis, right, that these children are missing forever, even leads social justice activists to say, well, we need to get DNA now. Like 23andMe steps in and says, I'm gonna give all of these kids free DNA kits, and we'll identify them because I'm on the left and I'm appalled by Trump's behavior. But to me, from this space, really the question is one of governance. And so how do we get the right people at the table, the people who've been thinking and working in this space for 25 years and have seen its outcome in 50 years, to think about the kind of governance that we need and how can we empower and elevate their voices so that they can at least be visible. And really what's happening now is there's alternative databases. So there's these databases, and then the Argentine group, for example, is working in Mexico and has an alternative database that is consented, that is not shared with the US government, that has all these practices that make it less effective, but also more governable. So, you know, I don't necessarily have I pose that question about futures. What does science otherwise allow? What kind of futures does it allow? But I do think science, as usual, as it's been practiced, particularly in the forensic realm, isn't going to get us to the ends that we want. And so part of our job in SFIS, I would argue, if we care about these things, is to posit those science otherwises. Like, what would it look like? Who needs to be at the table? What futures do we need to enable to create those spaces? And I don't know what they are, but I can certainly put you in touch with people who are trying to imagine them.